Hey guys, tonight we're wandering through cobbled streets slick with fog, past flickering lanterns and sleepy-eyed coachmen straight into the hush of a world that's just encountered something suspiciously pointy. Imagine this, it's the 1700s, and somewhere in a chilly, soot-streaked European port city, a crate has just been unloaded. The wood creaks, the straw rustles, and then there it is, a single pineapple, gleaming alien and for some strange reason slightly terrifying. Its skin looks like armor. Its top resembles a crown. You stare at it half curious, half convinced it might lunge. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere unexpected, tell me where you are and what time it is right now. I love hearing who's joining me on these little time travel naps. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the edge of the 18th century and someone hands you a pineapple. You don't quite know what to do with it. Do you eat it? Worship it? Polish it? Europeans in this era weren't quite sure either. The fruit had only recently arrived from far-off lands, Caribbean colonies, mostly carried across perilous oceans on slow, creaking ships. Pineapples were rare, expensive, and deeply misunderstood. You look around and realize no one knows exactly how it got here. One dock worker mutters it came from a volcano. Another claims it was fished out of a jungle swamp. Nobody really wants to admit they don't know. Pineapples have become a kind of Rorschach test for European imaginations. Back in the day, new plants weren't just plants. They were spectacles, symbols of power, sometimes even viewed with suspicion. Just like tomatoes had once been considered poisonous, and potatoes deeply unsettling underground food the horror, pineapples arrived wearing their spiky little suits and demanded attention. People gathered just to look at them. Sometimes they weren't even sure which end was up. Historians still argue whether the initial fascination was rooted in genuine botanical interest or just colonial novelty collecting. After all, the pineapple didn't look like anything familiar. It wasn't soft, like a peach, it wasn't round like an apple, and it certainly didn't behave like any self-respecting European fruit. When people first sliced one open and tasted that acidic sweetness, they were perplexed. Was it good, exotic, dangerous? There was a whisper in some circles that eating too much pineapple might melt your stomach lining. No pressure. As you follow the fruit's path from ship to market to manor house, you begin to notice the reactions it draws. Kids giggle nervously. Portly gentlemen adjust their wigs and murmur about tropical airs. A fashionable lady flutters her fan and refers to it only as the fruit. One elderly noble refuses to go near it, muttering about pineapples being grown in heathen soil. You may chuckle, but people once crossed themselves before touching a tomato too. It was a superstitious time, and pineapples? Well, pineapples looked like they had opinions. The fruit also didn't travel well. It bruised easily, it rotted quickly, and worse still, it smelled. Oh yes, left too long in a drawing room, and the pineapple's fragrance shifted from exotic delight to ye old compost heap. This only heightened its mystique. People feared it the way you might fear a particularly elegant houseguest who could turn on you without warning. Even the drawings of pineapples looked suspicious. Artists struggled to get the angles right. Some made them too smooth. Others added extra leaves. At least one early sketch resembles a pine cone in a tutu. The more you look, the more you wonder, were people genuinely curious about the fruit's nature or just afraid to admit they didn't know what it was? There's a man in a powdered wig holding one like a newborn baby. He doesn't blink once. That's how you begin to realize the pineapple wasn't just a fruit, it was a performance. Owning one meant you were worldly. Displaying one meant you had power. Eating one. Well, we'll get to that awkward etiquette later. For now, just breathe in the faintly sweet, faintly suspicious air around this odd little crown-shaped invader. A passing priest peers at it, frowns, and mutters something about temptation. A merchant offers to buy it for the price of a small horse. And somewhere in the back of your mind, a quiet thought settles: what kind of world gets nervous around fruit? You duck into a warm tavern, and even there the pineapple is the talk of the room. A man at the bar swears it cured his cousin's gout. Another claims his uncle's garden gnome turned to stone after seeing one. You chuckle softly. People really will invent anything when faced with something new. But there's a pattern here. A pattern of marvel turning to myth, myth turning to anxiety. All wrapped around a single spiny fruit. Just remember, you're not looking at a fruit. You're looking at an era's insecurity wearing a tropical disguise. You're sitting in a tall-backed chair, all velvet upholstery and awkward upholstery squeaks, inside a drawing room so stuffed with brocade and busts that you're not entirely sure where the wallpaper ends and the furniture begins. At the center of the room, perched on its own tiny pedestal, is a pineapple. No one touches it. No one dares. You glance around. Everyone is gazing at the pineapple like it might blink. Because in the 18th century, to own a pineapple was not about lunch. It was about legacy. It meant you had money. It meant you had connections. And it meant, most importantly, that you were just the right amount of fashionable and mad. This wasn't just a fruit. It was a status symbol, a calling card, a passive-aggressive way of saying I'm better than you without ever having to raise your powdered eyebrows. In polite society, one simply had to be seen with a pineapple. Eating it, risky. Owning it, exquisite. You run your fingers gently along the base of the pedestal. It's marble, or a very convincing imitation. The pineapple atop it, golden and aloof, smells faintly acidic. Someone nearby comments that it was brought over fresh from Barbados. You glance at the fruit again. It looks exhausted. Historians still argue whether pineapples were actually rare enough to warrant the panic, or if the scarcity was mostly manufactured by clever merchants and panicked nobles. But there's little doubt that supply lines were patchy at best. With no refrigeration, these fruits made the ocean journey only with great effort and sometimes luck. They had to be picked at just the right moment, handled with care, protected from storms, rats, and mold. If it survived the voyage in any recognizable form, it was a miracle, or at least that's what the host wanted guests to believe. A butler passes carrying a silver tray. Not with hors d'oeuvres, mind you. Just pineapple-scented napkins. Here's a real kicker sometimes. People rented pineapples. Yes, that's right. If you couldn't afford to import your own, you could lease one for a party. You wouldn't even peel it, just display it near the punch bowl, give it a quick polish, and return it the next day. Like a jeweled brooch, or a very fragrant baby Jesus. The rental industry for pineapples flourished among the merchant classes, the social climbers, and anyone throwing an event they couldn't quite afford. You'd pay good coin to have one perched near the cheese plate, knowing full well your guests would talk about it for weeks. And the fruit would then journey to its next party, a little browner, a little sadder, a little more famous. There's a story from the 1770s, possibly exaggerated but too good to leave out, of a man who brought a pineapple to a dinner party, set it down, gave a dramatic toast in its honor, and then took it home with him at the end of the evening. Didn't even peel it. Just a quiet "thank you all" and a dignified exit, pineapple tucked under his arm like a sleeping cat. And you have to admit it makes a strange sort of sense. Pineapples were wildly expensive. At times, a single one could cost the equivalent of several $100s today. To eat it would be essentially financial self-sabotage. Better to show it off until it rotted, which it often did. In fact, many high society folks never tasted a pineapple in their lives. They just smelled them, looked at them, bragged about having had one recently. And all of this creates a delicious irony. The pineapple was a fruit that gained its fame by not being eaten. The less accessible it was, the more desirable it became. A textbook case of scarcity meets spectacle. You walk through another room, this one dimly lit, where Oil portraits of noblemen show them posing stiffly beside pineapples. One has it tucked under his arm like a scroll. Another rests his hand on it tenderly, like it's a pet. The fruit became a sort of visual shorthand for empire adventure and refined taste. Never mind that most of the men in those paintings probably couldn't tell a pineapple from a beehive in the dark. And then there's the tale of King Charles II commissioning a now famous painting of himself receiving a pineapple from his gardener. The moment was entirely staged. The gardener John Rose didn't grow the pineapple, it had been imported, but the image was meant to imply something deeply colonial: the king's reach, the gardener's genius, the fruit's approval. People stood in galleries admiring that painting and murmured, "How clever! He's taming nature." You stop in a salon where powdered wigs tilt forward attentively. The hostess gestures toward the pineapple and sighs. A noble fruit. Everyone nods as though they've just witnessed a christening. No one asks what it tastes like. That would be rude. And slowly, the pattern becomes clearer. The pineapple wasn't beloved for being a fruit. It was adored for what it implied: that you had ship servants' colonies, that your dinner parties mattered, that your very existence was touched by exotic riches beyond the reach of lesser mortals. So you sip your spiced wine and marvel at the spiky aromatic orb glowing on its little stand. No one eats it. No one breathes too close. And yet somehow it steals the entire evening. You're still lingering near the pineapple, half listening to someone drone on about Portuguese sea routes when the conversation shifts to something far more interesting: cost. Not of travel, not of wine, but of that fruit sitting silently in the room like an edible guest of honor. It turns out that pineapple, it's worth more than the entire month's wages of the maid who dusted the pedestal it's sitting on. You blink. Because here's the thing. Owning a pineapple in 18th century Europe wasn't just expensive. It was absurdly expensive. A single fresh pineapple imported from the Caribbean could cost at times the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. That's not exaggeration. That's receipts. Now imagine renting one. Yes, we touched on this earlier, but let's slow down and really soak in the madness of the pineapple rental economy. You're a middling merchant, ambitious, fashionably in debt, and in desperate need of clout. You've got a dinner party coming up. Your wife's cousin's husband works for the East India Company, and he's definitely coming. You need to impress. So what do? You pay a small fortune to rent a pineapple. It arrives in its own little wooden box, possibly with a velvet lining. The delivery boy gives you a look, equal parts admiration and pity. You set it carefully on the table, maybe under a glass dome. Your guests arrive. They nod solemnly at it. One of them leans in, sniffs. You beam. The pineapple has done its job. The next morning you return it. A little more wilted, sure, but still structurally pineapple-shaped. Maybe the next guy down the street rents it tomorrow. Historians still argue whether these rentals were common practice or just a particularly delicious urban legend. But rental records and gossip columns of the day mention it often enough that it's hard to dismiss completely. One thing is clear: pineapples were so expensive, so coveted, that people found creative ways to pretend they could afford them. Some even faked it. Pineapple replicas made of waxwood or painted gourds started circulating at parties. If no one touched it, no one knew. Until some overly curious guest poked it and got their fingers sticky with varnish. Whoops! You wander through a narrow market street packed with carriages and hawkers and the scent of roasted chestnuts, and you overhear a frantic buyer arguing with a fruit vendor. The vendor is holding a very tired-looking pineapple. The buyer points at the bruises on the rind like a suspicious noble checking gold coins. Eventually, they agree on a price: a week's income for something that may not even last the carriage ride home. But the absurdity doesn't stop there. You duck into a shop selling colonial novelties. There a pineapple sits under lock and key like a rare diamond. Next to it, pineapple-shaped snuff boxes, cufflinks, embroidery patterns, all expensive, all in demand. Owning anything remotely pineapple-related became a sort of shorthand for yes. I read the Gentleman's Magazine and own a globe. One pamphlet from the time, yes, pamphlets. People loved a good fruit gossip piece reports a gentleman paying to have his butler walk around the city center carrying a pineapple in plain view. Not to sell it, not to eat it, just to be seen with it, like a very spiky citrus-scented influencer. And for the truly elite pineapple ownership took on nearly absurd levels of display. Some lords had conservatories built just to try growing pineapples themselves. That's right, full greenhouses heated with coal stoves and elaborate pulley systems, all to create the illusion that the family fruit grew domestically. In reality, most of those pineapples still came by ship, and the gardens were just stage sets for social ambition. There's something about that kind of extravagance so committed, so ridiculous, that makes you want to both applaud and cry. And through it all, the fruit itself never changes. Still spiky, still sweet, still fundamentally a fruit, but the value, oh, the value shifts wildly, depending on who's looking at it and why they're looking. There's a household ledger tucked behind a desk in one upper-class home that includes a pineapple under luxury displays alongside imported silk and wine. A note beside it simply reads, "Do not cut. Use thrice." You assume that means for 3 parties, but part of you hopes it's just an aggressive minimalist's mantra. You pass a young couple on the street debating whether they should spend their wedding funds on a pineapple centerpiece or actual catering. The pineapple wins, naturally. And so you continue drifting through a world where fruit has become performance art, where price tags are not about taste but prestige, and where the simple question of how much does that cost might require a footman, a banker, and a few hours of explanation. You smile faintly and move on. After all, the pineapple economy is only getting started. You wander deeper into the city, passing narrow alleyways that smell faintly of soot, wet cobblestone, and something lightly fermented, possibly someone's idea of perfume. Through a crooked wooden door, you enter what looks like a private gentleman's club or possibly a very well-funded society for people who enjoy arguing about fruit. Inside, the air is thick with pipe smoke and the scent of waxed mustache. Men in elaborate coats, some clearly sweating under the weight of their dignity, are engaged in a heated debate. Not about politics, not about trade. No. They're arguing whether pineapples are made of beeswax or tiny coiled ropes of plant flesh woven by jungle spirits. You step quietly to the side and listen. Clearly, one insists thumping the table for effect. The outer rind is composed of resin exuded by tropical trees, hardened by heat. Everyone knows that. Another sips his brandy and counters. You fool, they absorb the sun. That's why they're so warm to the touch. It's a fire fruit. There's heat inside it. A third, eyes wide with the manic confidence of a man who's been up since dawn sketching botany diagrams, leans forward and whispers, "Have you considered bees?" You try not to laugh, because this is a very real thing that happened. European botanists in all their powdered wig glory had absolutely no idea what to make of the pineapple. They knew it was a fruit probably, but how it grew, that was anybody's guess. Historians still argue whether early European theories about pineapple botany were genuine misunderstandings or convenient mysticism used to sell books and lecture seats. But the confusion was widespread. Some insisted the pineapple grew underground like a tuber. Others claimed it sprang from the heads of decapitated jungle snakes. One famous pamphlet suggested the crown of the pineapple was an antenna, allowing it to communicate with other fruits in the Caribbean. You might think they were joking. They weren't. And things only got more complicated when people tried to grow them. As you walk past one gentleman's estate, you notice an elaborate glass hothouse structure, a kind of glowing palace built entirely for 1 or 2 struggling pineapple plants. The gardener stands nearby, arms folded proudly over his apron, recounting the tale of how he spoke to the pineapple daily to encourage growth. Responds best to polite Latin, he adds. One enthusiastic baron even commissioned a book about the spiritual temperament of fruit-bearing plants. Chapter 7 naturally was devoted to pineapples and their mysterious sunthirst. There's something almost charming about the depth of the confusion. It wasn't just the public that didn't know how pineapples worked. It was scientists, too. One famous naturalist of the era claimed the pineapple was proof that God had a sense of humor, a fruit no one could grow, everyone desired, and very few dared to eat. You reach a quiet study where an old man with rimless spectacles pores over sketches of pineapple cross-sections. He murmurs to himself, tracing his quill across the paper. The diagrams are beautiful concentric circles, delicate shading, elegant Latin notations, and completely wrong. One of them clearly labels the core seat of the fruit's emotion. A servant brings tea. The scholar barely notices. Back in town, things are only marginally more sensible. A small crowd is gathered to see a pineapple reveal in which a curtain is drawn back to expose a particularly ripe specimen placed atop a gilded pedestal. A man in a cravat delivers an overly dramatic monologue about the pineapple's internal energies. You're not sure whether to applaud or call for help. And yet, this fascination, this clumsy theorizing, all speaks to something very human. A desire to understand the unfamiliar, to categorize the unknowable. Even if your categories include fruit, not fruit, and possibly enchanted, one fringe theory even posits that pineapples were the remains of ancient animals fossilized mid-explosion. This was from a man who also claimed peaches gave off magnetic vibrations, so grain of salt. You sit beside a window and gaze out at the darkened street. A cart rolls by carrying what might be a crate of pineapples or possibly cannonballs, hard to tell in the low light. Somewhere nearby, a parlor pianist plinks out a sleepy waltz. The wind smells faintly of sea air and cinnamon. And in this atmosphere of gentle absurdity, it starts to make sense that pineapples became more than just fruit. They were the perfect mystery, spiky, sweet, expensive, and hard to explain. The more questions they raise, the more society seemed to adore them, or fear them, or pretend they were experts when really no one had the faintest clue. Even now, sitting in the quiet glow of a candlelit study, you hear someone in the next room whisper, "I hear if you slice one wrong, it bites you back." You're back in the drawing room. It's the same pineapple, same regal posture, same stiff little crown. But now it's noticeably mushier. The golden skin has dulled, the leaves have started to curl, and there's an unmistakable tang in the air, a fruity whisper of decay, the kind that makes you want to both sniff it again and leave the room immediately. No one talks about it. Everyone knows the pineapple is rotting. You watch as one guest glances at it too long, then quickly sips their wine as if to apologize. Another shifts in their chair when a faint drip of juice glistens down the side of the pedestal. Someone sneezes, no doubt, from the spores of status slowly fermenting in the air. Because while the pineapple may have entered European homes as a miracle of empire, it often exited in a quiet haze of spoilage and regret. That's the unspoken truth. Pineapples didn't last. Not with 18th century transportation, not in rooms kept warm for corseted guests, and certainly not on display for weeks at a time. Historians still argue whether people kept them on display too long out of pride, superstition, or plain denial. Maybe it was all three. But one thing's certain: by the time many guests left a pineapple party, the fruit in question had gone from conversation piece to science experiment. You leave the drawing room and enter the kitchen wing where two servants are whispering in distress. The pineapple has begun to leak onto the lace tablecloth. They dab at it with embroidered napkins and mutter, "It's turning." One says they saw the same thing at Lady Everleigh's last spring, and the house reeked for days. The other nods solemnly. Third one this month. The pressure to keep the pineapple fresh was real. Some hosts turned to desperate preservation methods, packing it in snow, smothering it in spices, even sealing it in beeswax. Others, more practical if a bit daring, decided to finally cut into it and eat the thing. And that's when the fear really kicked in. Because, you see, this wasn't just an expensive fruit, it was an expensive gamble. What if it had already turned sour? What if it had fermented? What if, heaven forbid, it gave someone indigestion? And digestion in the 18th century was no small matter. An upset stomach wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a full-blown medical crisis. You could be bedridden for days. Your doctor might prescribe bleeding, or worse, suggest toast water. So there it sat, an uneaten pineapple slowly dying in public. You pass through another room, a smaller salon this time, where someone has tried to mask the pineapple's decay with rose petals. It doesn't help. The scent that hits you is part perfume, part compost. Someone lights a clove candle. You quietly open a window. There's a fringe medical theory that's floating around too. Some physicians are warning of the dangers of pineapple miasma, that is, the harmful vapors released by overripe tropical fruit. One paper insists it can unbalance one's humors. Another suggests it might stir in the blood a fiery longing, whatever that means. One gentleman looking a bit peaky claims he stood too near a decomposing pineapple and hasn't slept properly in days. His hands tremble slightly. His doctor has prescribed cold compresses and oat gruel. You walk into a side room empty finally, except for a lone pineapple perched on a marble slab near a window. This one is clearly past its prime. Fruit flies circle it like tiny mourners. The rind is sunken, and the smell, well, let's just say you wouldn't describe it as fresh. And yet it's still here, still on display, because no one wants to be the first to admit it's time to let go. The thing is, in this world of delicate decorum and theatrical opulence, appearance is everything. And even a rotting pineapple still looks rich, at least from across the room. Maybe your guests won't notice. Maybe no one will say anything. Maybe it'll survive just one more soiree. But you and I both know it won't. There's a joke you overhear from one of the footmen murmured under his breath as he cleans around the withering fruit. The pineapple has gone off, but don't worry. So has the host. You smile, and then you find a curious little moment. A maid tiptoeing into the empty salon to touch the pineapple very gently with the tip of her finger. Her eyes widen, not in awe, but in mild horror. She wipes her hand on her apron and backs out silently. The myth has been punctured. The fruit isn't divine, it's just overripe. And that, in a way, is the true arc of the pineapple in Europe. It arrives like a miracle, glows like a trophy, and exits like a whisper no one wants to acknowledge. The sun has just dipped below the chimneys, and you find yourself wandering into a quiet side garden, one of those overly designed 18th century spaces where even the gravel seems arranged by committee. The hedges are symmetrical, the roses are naturally tidy, and the statues are all missing noses for reasons no one talks about. At the far end of the path stands something oddly out of place. A squat glass-roofed structure with iron framing, and a brick base puffing faintly like a contented teapot. A hothouse. You walk closer and peer through the fogged glass. Inside, under the warm artificial sun of coal-powered stoves and a little too much money, sit two pineapples. Growing. In Europe, sort of. This is a pinery, and it's one of the great absurdities of Georgian wealth. You step inside. The air is humid and rich with the scent of moss, steam, and optimism. The gardener, coatless, flushed, and slightly unhinged, greets you with a proud wave. Third attempt this year, he beams. This one's almost symmetrical. You nod gravely. It would be rude not to. Because for the European elite, growing your own pineapple was the ultimate flex. It said, I not only possess wealth, but the time, patience, and hired help to simulate a tropical ecosystem in the dead of Yorkshire winter. These hotbeds or pineapple pits required precise control. Double brick walls, layers of manure for insulation, adjustable skylights, and an entire staff dedicated to rotating the fruits by hand for even tanning. Yes, tanning. Uneven color could ruin the illusion of perfection. Heaven forbid your pineapple be blotchy. Historians still argue whether these hothouses produced viable pineapples consistently or if most were quietly replaced with imports before the reveal. But records show that landowners sunk small fortunes into these facilities, sometimes naming them after family members or biblical gardens. One famous estate simply called theirs the House of Fruit and Fire. Inside, the gardener proudly points to a logbook. Entries include weather conditions, soil acidity, and curiously a section labeled Pineapple Dreams. You don't ask. What's more impressive or terrifying is the engineering. To mimic tropical nights, servants were assigned to heat stones by fire and place them around the soil before sundown. Others misted the air with boiled rainwater. There are even rumors of someone singing to the fruit softly in Portuguese. You find yourself wondering, did anyone grow these just to eat them? Not really. Most European-grown pineapples weren't meant for consumption. They were ceremonial. Some families passed them between households like heirlooms. Ah yes, says one visiting cousin, I remember this one. We met in '67. There's a now-lost poem once published in The Lady's Gentle Reminder, which described the life cycle of a pineapple as born in heat, raised in lies, and buried in applause. You watch as a young apprentice carefully brushes one of the plants with a goose-feather duster. His concentration is fierce, as though disturbing a single leaf might result in expulsion, or worse, social demotion. Outside the pinery, you find a set of instruction manuals stacked neatly. Titles include The Humid Art Raising Tropical Fruit in Cold Moral Climates, Fruits of Fortune, On the Ethical Display of Imported Produce, and of course, the classic pineapple geometry for the aspiring gentleman. A marginal note in one reads, Do not permit the dog near the pits. He offends the fruit. You stroll back toward the main house amused. Because for all their extravagance, these pineries were a form of theater. The stage was botanical, the budget bloated, and the critics both fascinated and quietly skeptical. Most locals knew these fruits would be paraded once, then either preserved in brandy or discreetly composted before anyone noticed the mold. But for the elite, that single moment, a garden party unveiling a perfectly lit fruit on a silver tray, a slow gasp from the audience, was worth it. One lord famously held a pineapple ball the night his first homegrown fruit reached maturity. There was a music dancing, a poem written in its honor, and a dramatic unveiling at midnight, during which the fruit was placed on a spinning mirror and lit from above with whale oil lanterns. It collapsed 2 hours later from overripeness, but no one cared. The painter had already finished the portrait, and maybe that's the point. The pinery wasn't about agriculture. It was about narrative. An illusion of tropical mastery crafted from glass manure and sheer financial willpower. You pause at the door of the glass house and glance back. The gardener is humming now, watering the soil with tea leaves steeped in rainwater. The pineapple doesn't respond, but then again it never had to. Later that evening, you find yourself seated at yet another dinner table, this one glossier, grander, and infinitely more fragile than the last. The silverware gleams like it was polished by angels. The candles flicker just slightly out of sync. The butler appears to be gliding rather than walking. And at the head of the table, you guessed it, a pineapple. But this one isn't just for show, it's the event. You can feel it in the air. This isn't a rental, a replica, or a reluctant house guest on the verge of fermentation. No, this pineapple is going to be sliced. Eventually, everyone knows it. And everyone is pretending not to know it. You fiddle with your napkin watching as the host delivers an impassioned speech about colonial trade routes, which somehow ends with a heartfelt toast to this most noble fruit. Applause follows. Someone wipes a tear. The pineapple sits silently glowing in the candlelight like a spiky monarch awaiting coronation. And then it begins. The knife comes out. Not a regular kitchen knife, mind you, but a custom-made blade with an ivory handle engraved with what you can only hope is a pineapple and not a very confused hedgehog. The butler steadies the fruit. The host nods solemnly. And with all the gravity of a man performing minor surgery, the first slice is made. You lean forward anticipating something sublime. And it's good. Juicy. sweet, a little tart, but mostly it is a fruit. The room is silent as people chew, and you can almost hear the collective realization dawning. This was it. Historians still argue whether guests in these moments were truly impressed or just locked into a kind of polite, frilly horror at how anticlimactic it all was. The pineapple, while exotic and rare, was ultimately just a tropical bromeliad with edible ambitions. But no one could say that. Instead, they murmured polite praise. Ah, yes, very spirited. A fine texture, wouldn't you say? I'm getting notes of prestige. You watch as a slice is passed your way on a porcelain plate that costs more than your shoes. It glistens slightly like it knows how many sailors died for its arrival. You take a bite, and honestly, it's nice. Refreshing, but perhaps not 4 months' salary and a hothouse nice. You hear someone say they expected it to taste more golden, whatever that means. And so the pineapple is consumed, slowly, almost reverently. No one dares ask for seconds lest they appear greedy or worse, unsophisticated. A few guests pretend to savor it longer than necessary, letting the juice roll over their tongue with the exaggerated expression of a person tasting art. Then almost comically, a tray of sugared almonds is passed around and the entire room sighs in visible relief. Finally, something familiar. But here's the strange thing. Despite the anticlimax, people loved the experience. They wrote about it in letters, mentioned it in diaries, even requested portraits of themselves beside the sliced remains. Not because it tasted divine, but because it had been a moment, a rare golden fleeting thing. One lady's journal describes it this way. We dined in the company of splendor, and its rind was as fragrant as the memory will be tomorrow. Another simply wrote, pineapple consumed, danced until 1, shoes ruined. You stroll into the next room where 2 artists are attempting to sketch what's left of the fruit before it fully collapses. One is working in charcoal, the other in watercolor. They've both chosen to depict it as whole, untouched, already rewriting reality to preserve the fantasy. You notice that the pineapple slices themselves are being collected, not eaten, but placed delicately in crystal dishes to be dried candied, or in one household's case painted into a mural. They're no longer food, they're souvenirs. It's the edible equivalent of pressing flowers in a diary, a sort of botanical nostalgia. And for those who couldn't afford the real thing, recipes began circulating for mock pineapple made from apple vinegar and imagination. Some even added rum and saffron for that imported luxury flavor. You pass a servant muttering, "Tastes like soap," under his breath while handing out a tray. Meanwhile, the real pineapple's core fibrous, slightly bitter, is ceremonially burned in the hearth. The host calls it a sacrifice to civility. You try not to snort. It's all so wonderfully ridiculous, but also kind of sweet. In the way people will go to the ends of the earth, or at least the ends of their wallets, to make something feel special. You watch the last guest rise, pat their stomach, and announce, "That fruit shall be spoken of in my will." Of course it will. Morning arrives in a soft gray hush. You open a curtain and peer out into a quiet lane just as a delivery cart trundles by its wheels, kicking up last night's rain from between cobblestones. A basket of what looks like turnips sits beside something else, a pineapple. Not perched, not cradled, just sitting awkwardly among the vegetables like royalty forced to ride third class. And that's your cue to explore a new layer of this fruity farce, the growing black market of pineapple rentals. Yes, rentals. You step into a cozy bookshop nearby, dimly lit, pleasantly musty. A clerk nods to you without looking up from his dog-eared pamphlet, a practical guide to hosting with borrowed fruit. You leaf through a few pages and begin to realize this was a whole industry. By the mid-18th century, pineapples had become so absurdly fashionable and expensive that some clever entrepreneurs found a loophole. Why buy one when you could rent one? Historians still argue whether this practice began with struggling merchants or ambitious butlering schools. But by 1740, it was an open secret among the middling classes. If you needed to impress at dinner, you could pay a small fortune to temporarily display a pineapple, just long enough for the guests to whisper and swoon. The rules were simple: no touching, no slicing, and for heaven's sake, no sniffing too close. You were buying time, not flavor. You find yourself wandering to one of these pineapple lenders, a small but respectable establishment tucked behind a perfumer's. The owner, Mr. Howarth, greets you with the pride of someone who deals not in fruit, but in aspiration. He lifts the velvet cloth off his centerpiece. 3 shillings for the hour, 7 for the evening, extra if it's still symmetrical. The pineapple beneath is flawless, too flawless. You suspect it may have been waxed. He swears it hasn't. He opens a logbook, its pages filled with bookings, weddings, name-day suppers, poetry salons impressing the Duchess, and one simply labeled Revenge. Rentals came with presentation kits including a footed tray, complimentary doilies, and if you paid extra, a borrowed butler to linger nearby and describe the fruit's alleged journey from the colonies. You laugh softly as Mr. Howarth recalls a scandalous moment when a renter forgot to return the pineapple on time. It had already been promised to a viscount's anniversary dinner, leading to a kerfuffle involving a late-stage switcheroo and a hastily disguised papaya. No one ever found out. Well, almost no one. The pineapple rental craze became so widespread that it seeped into literature and satire. Pamphleteers mocked pineapple people as shallow imitators of nobility. One cartoon depicted a middle-class family worshipping a pineapple like a shrine, their real food untouched and cold. And yet, boss, it worked. The borrowed fruit conferred borrowed status. It didn't matter if your candlelight flickered oddly or if your roast was a bit dry. If you had the fruit, you had the room. One newspaper ad you find tucked in a display case reads, "For higher elegant fruit of tropical distinction, may be used in portraiture or centerpiece arrangement. Conversation guaranteed. Minor bruising concealed." Some renters even arrange for the pineapple to arrive in a separate carriage, as if to say, "My dinner is important, but this guest deserves his own ride." Mr. Howarth admits some of his pineapples had served over 30 events before being retired. Retired in this case means stewed painted or on one occasion bronzed. You imagine the fruit's resume ball at Lord Wesley's poetry night and Bath card game in Soho, one very uncomfortable lunch with a bishop. And what about the renters? They knew the truth, of course. But as one diary entry noted, "If it impresses the in-laws, who am I to deny a fruit at stage?" Back in the bookshop, you find a curious guidebook tucked between a copy of The Art of Table Winking and Parlor Games for Pious Girls. It's titled The Pretender's Pineapple, a manual for middle-class marvels. Inside are tips for answering awkward questions. If asked how it tastes, respond with, profound. Never admit it's borrowed, say it was a gift from the West Indies. If it begins to soften, claim it's a rare variety that bruises with beauty. You set the book down gently smiling. Because as much as this was about appearances, it was also about hope. About the very human desire to be part of something grander, shinier, fruitier. And somehow, this spiky golden guest of honor, whether bought, borrowed, or barely balanced on a serving tray, became a symbol of upward dreams. Even if those dreams came with a strict return policy. Evening falls again, soft as silk, and twice as expensive. You now find yourself standing beneath the glittering chandelier of a modest but ambitious townhouse in Edinburgh. The smell of beeswax, burnt onion, and powdered wigs fills the air. There's another party, of course, but tonight something's different. This one doesn't have a real pineapple. You glance at the table, blinking once, then again. That's a painted gourd. You're not imagining it. The fruit sitting proudly atop a gilded dish is in fact a carefully modified squash coated in golden lacquer, adorned with hand-glued paper spikes and topped with a tuft of frond-like foliage that might have come from a broom. And it is glorious. This, dear listener, is the world of faux pineapples, a thriving underground craft among the budget-conscious elite of the 18th century. Because when you couldn't grow one, import one, or rent one well, you made one. Historians still argue whether this trend began as a satire of upper-class affectation or as a sincere attempt at inclusion. But by the 1760s, fake pineapples were everywhere, in waxwood papier-mâché and one suspicious case marzipan. One London artisan built a side business creating fruit illusions for theater companies and desperate hostesses. You wander into the dining room watching as guests ooh and ah in polite succession. No one dares question the fruit's authenticity. After all, who would fake a pineapple? That would be gauche. And yet there it sits wobbling slightly with the vibrations of nearby footfalls. You overhear a whisper. It's from a rare region in the Lesser Antilles, grows lopsided. The other guest nods sagely. The host exhales with quiet relief. Because that's the beauty of a fake pineapple, you only have to fool people for as long as they don't reach for it. And no one wants to be the person who slices a display. To help things along, a clever host might stage the room just so dim candlelight, thick table runners, and subtle floral perfumes that distract from the fruit's oddly matte finish. You pass a shelf of such props, next to them a how-to booklet, Fruiting on a Budget. Secrets for the Savvy Hostess. One page reads, if crafting in papier-mâché adds cinnamon to the glue for tropical illusion, never use too much glitter unless in bath. Practice your gasp of delight in front of a mirror before guests arrive. What's even stranger is that some of these fakes became heirlooms. One family in Sussex proudly passed down a wooden pineapple for 3 generations, keeping it in a velvet-lined box and unveiling it during birthdays, funerals, and particularly awkward in-law visits. You find one such object in a nearby cabinet. The tag reads, Lady Penelope's Ceremonial Fruit, 1783. It looks like it was carved by someone who had only heard of pineapples via rumor. And yet, in its own bizarre way, it's beautiful. The desire behind it, the yearning to belong to, impress, to conjure magic from papier-mâché and powdered starch, is almost touching. You picture a young woman arranging the fruit on the mantel, adjusting the candles and stepping back and whispering to herself, yes, this will do. You wander into a sitting room where a group of teenagers is giggling. One of them has pulled the fake pineapple off its stand and is pretending it's a spyglass. Another mutters, if the pineapple falls, so does the facade. Their mother shuffles in, gasps, and snatches the fruit away, scolding them in half-hearted terror. You imagine the same scene playing out across Europe, fakes wobbling precariously, toddlers poking them with forks, dogs mistaking them for chew toys. And yet they endured. Fake pineapples even began appearing in architectural details, etched into railings carved atop bedposts and embroidered into chair backs. The fruit had transcended its edible origins. It had become a motif, a symbol, a polite way of saying, we belong to this glittering, absurd world, or at least we'd like to. One gentleman writing in the Polite Observer called these symbols aspirational oddities. He added, much like my cousin's wig, ostensibly functional but largely ornamental. And that's the secret thread here. Whether real or rented, carved or conjured, the pineapple served the same purpose, not to feed but to signify. It was the social equivalent of speaking French badly, inelegant maybe, but clearly trying. You step back into the entryway. The guests are beginning to leave. A footman carefully tucks the faux fruit back into its case, placing it beside a box of lace gloves and a tin of almond biscuits. No one says anything. No one needs to, because for one shimmering evening the illusion held. The squash became a story. The story became status. And everyone played their part, even you. You find yourself walking beneath an overcast sky, now the city soft with chimney smoke and the faint clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Somewhere nearby, a church bell strikes noon, or possibly one of those clocks that always run slow. Either way, the streets have a sleepy rhythm and you fall into step with it. But just as you pass the corner of a printmaker's shop, something peculiar catches your eye. A pineapple. Not a fruit this time, but a door knocker. You stop, blink, knock gently. It makes a dull, slightly judgmental thud. Welcome to the era of pineapple symbolism in architecture and domestic decor, where fruit made the leap from table to threshold and stayed there. See, once pineapples had fully settled into the collective European imagination as shorthand for luxury welcome and impossible achievement. They began to appear everywhere you'd least expect them, not just at dinners, but in bricks and mortar, iron and lace. Historians still argue whether this shift was driven by genuine fondness for the fruit or simply a growing obsession with displaying tropical aesthetics in increasingly permanent ways. Either way, by the late 1700s, pineapples were showing up on gates' garden walls, chairbacks, fire screens, napkin rings, and curtain tassels. Entire rooms could be coordinated around the pineapple motif. If you had the budget or the delusion, you duck into a nearby parlor shop. Inside, the clerk is arranging pineapple-shaped salt cellars in a mahogany display case. She tells you with a half-smile that nothing says refinement like seasoning one's food with metaphor. Further in, you discover an entire wall of household goods, all featuring that same unmistakable silhouette. A bulbous body, a crown of exaggerated leaves, and that textured, spiked exterior that screams, "This used to cost more than your horse." One set of embroidered napkins even includes a stitched poem, "Be ye welcome, friend or foe, beneath the fruit that once said no," which doesn't rhyme unless you read it with a very specific regional accent. But no matter. You visit an upper-class estate outside of town later that afternoon where the pineapple theme hits peak enthusiasm. There are pineapple finials on the garden wall. The gateposts are flanked with massive stone fruits, each the size of a child's optimism. One has a pigeon nesting inside. Inside the home, a ballroom chandelier features delicately carved pineapple shapes, each one hand-painted with gold leaf. The hostess claims it was inspired by a dream I had on a tropical island I've never been to. The footman's livery includes tiny fruit-shaped buttons. The wallpaper is suggestive. You're not sure whether the pattern is pineapples or just very aggressive artichokes, but no one's correcting you. And then there's the dining room, a showcase of pineapple devotion. On one wall, a full oil painting of the family's first homegrown pineapple harvest. The fruit is slightly out of scale, looming over the gardener like a benevolent deity. The grandfather clock chimes. The chime sounds suspiciously like it's been tuned to mimic the opening notes of God Save the Pine. You ask politely why the fruit fixation. The lady of the house explains with absolute sincerity, the pineapple represents the warmth of hospitality and the ability to control nature with sheer force of will. That tracks. And it wasn't just homes. Public buildings too got the fruity treatment. In places like Bath, Edinburgh, and even parts of colonial America, pineapple iconography found its way into inns, banks, schools, and even prisons. There's a historic jail in Pennsylvania where the entry arch is adorned with a pineapple keystone, an architectural joke, perhaps implying that even those being locked away deserve a symbolic welcome. You pause at one final artifact, a delicate porcelain chamber pot painted with vines, cherubs, and you guessed it, a pineapple. Was this meant as irony? A genuine gesture of aesthetic unity, or perhaps a sly jab at all those pineapple pretenders you met back in Section 9? You'll never know. But it does confirm something important: the fruit's image had become untethered from its reality. It no longer needed to be tasted or even physically present to do its job. The idea of the pineapple had become enough. It had migrated from the plate to the parlor, from stomach to status, from absurdity to interior design. As you walk back into the gray light of the street, a small child passes you carrying a toy carved like a pineapple. You hear her say, "This is the queen," as she holds it aloft like a crown. And honestly, she's not wrong. You wake to the soft creak of a carriage door and the smell of sea salt in the air. Somehow you've made it to a port town, cobbled streets gleaming under the early morning light, gulls flapping with that half-bored aggression only gulls can manage. Here, finally, is where the pineapple's journey began, or rather ended. Because before it sat on a rented silver tray in Bath, or posed dramatically on a Scottish mantle, the pineapple had to travel a voyage nearly as dramatic as the dinner parties it later inspired. You make your way to the docks where crates are stacked high with rum barrels, sacks of sugar bolts of coarse cloth, and every so often nestled carefully under protective straw a single pineapple. This was no mere shipment, it was a mission. In the 18th century, transporting a pineapple from the Caribbean or Central America to Europe was a logistical nightmare. The fruit was delicate, sensitive to temperature, and how to put this delicately, just not that into long boat rides. Historians still argue whether pineapples shipped by sea were ever truly ripe upon arrival, or if most were already halfway to mush. Either way, to even attempt the feat, you needed an astonishing amount of care and a little luck. The fruit had to be harvested at exactly the right moment, not too early, lest it taste like hopeful wood, and not too late, lest it arrive as soup in a rind. Once picked, it had to be packed gently, swaddled like a royal infant, and stored in a part of the ship that wouldn't get too warm, too wet, too shaken, or too frequently bumped into by a distracted sailor carrying rum. You pass a ship's log pinned behind glass. One entry reads, Feb 14th. Lost 2 pineapples to rolling sea. One possibly eaten by cook. Claims ignorance. Another, March 3rd. Remaining pineapple intact. Passengers requested be played music. The absurd reverence didn't end at port. Upon arrival in England, the fruit faced a bureaucratic gauntlet. Inspections, taxes, declarations of origin. One customs clerk reportedly built a pineapple-only desk decorated with sketches of previous entries, and a small carved fruit he claimed watched for smugglers. You step into a warehouse-turned-museum, where crates have been reconstructed with the original shipping materials, moss cloth, straw, and occasionally, wool. Yes, they packed pineapples like fragile porcelain and still lost half of them to mold or bruising. Some merchants went a step further, building special pineapple cages with miniature hammocks inside, designed to suspend the fruit and protect it from every jolt and sway. Others tried preserving them in rum sugar syrup or by drying the rind and stuffing it with crushed citrus. None of these worked especially well, but they looked very determined doing it. And still, for every 5 pineapples sent, perhaps one arrived in a condition fit for display. These were the elite of the elite, the Beyoncé-level fruit. The few, the spiky. One trader's journal you glimpse calls them fragile ambassadors from paradise. Another refers to them less poetically as delicate stinking bombs. You chuckle as you picture the arrival, a crowd at the docks, breath held, as a crate is gently opened, only for the scent of fermentation to announce not this time. And yet they kept trying. Because to arrive in London with a fresh pineapple was like arriving with bottled sunshine. It meant access to colonies, wealth connections, and a very committed ship captain. It meant you had friends in hot places. It meant you could bring the tropics home even if, ironically, you'd never left England. You step aboard a recreated merchant ship, wobbling slightly as you descend below deck. The hold is dark, damp, and full of squeaky floorboards. But tucked into one corner is a wooden crate, straw-lined and empty now. Above it, a small sign reads, Replica of a pineapple's journey from Jamaica circa 1761. Spoiled in transit. Again. It's humbling, really. So much effort, risk, and absurd ingenuity for a single piece of fruit. But that's the 18th century for you. They invented entire professions around dinner decoration. This was a time when people wore powdered wigs in storms and added lead to their makeup with a straight face. And somehow the pineapple fit right in. You exit the ship squinting into the light. Somewhere nearby, a dock worker drops a box and mutters, Not again. You can't tell if it's cargo or just tradition. Either way, you smile, because now you understand the pineapple wasn't just a fruit. It was a challenge. a status symbol in a rind, a spiky dare to the world that said, try and keep me alive across 3,000 miles of chaos. And sometimes they did. You're standing now in a dusty drawing room, sunlight filtering through curtains stiff with starch. On the wall hangs a portrait. Serious gentleman, powdered wig, solemn expression, and what's that in his hand? Yes, a pineapple. You move closer. The man looks mildly annoyed, as if he's just been told the fruit cost more than a carriage and must now pose with it for 2 hours. His fingers are awkwardly curled around its base like it might bite him. It's a still life in suffering. Welcome to the world of pineapple portraiture, where no self-respecting aristocrat of the 18th century missed a chance to immortalize themselves alongside the fruit of the gods, not holding it. You might find it perched on a plinth beside their elbow, or subtly embroidered into a waistcoat, or carved into the back of a nearby chair. Historians still argue whether these inclusions were symbolic gestures of hospitality or just showboating in oil paint. Either way, portraits with pineapples became an oddly persistent genre. To be painted with a pineapple was to say, I am refined, wealthy, and likely insufferable. You explore the walls, dozens of frames, faces staring down through time. One woman clutches her pineapple like a bouquet. Another has placed hers on a silk pillow. One gentleman has balanced it atop a globe. Bold move. You imagine the painter trying not to laugh. One especially hilarious canvas depicts a small child offering a pineapple to a goat. The goat looks as skeptical as you feel. There's no record of how that one turned out. But this wasn't just private eccentricity. These portraits often hung in the main halls of family estates, meant to impress guests and confuse future art historians. In the adjoining gallery, you find one labeled Sir Egbert Marlowe and his pineapple, 1772. Sir Egbert wears the grim face of a man whose pineapple budget is bigger than his wardrobe budget. He has 3 buttons. The pineapple is glowing. And yet, not all fruit made it into frames by accident. By the mid-18th century, it was common for artists to keep a small stock of decorative pineapples, either rented, yes, even the art world borrowed them painted from memory or invented entirely. If a sitter couldn't afford the real thing but wanted to seem, fruity artists were known to add the pineapple post-sitting, much like modern photographers might add sparkle filters or suspicious abs. One diary entry from a painter's apprentice reads, added pineapple as requested. Never seen one in person. Guessed its shape. Hope it convinces. You step into a smaller study walls lined with miniature portraits. Here, the symbolism gets even weirder. One 1775 painting shows a pineapple wearing a crown. Another shows it sliced and scattered around a table, while guests point dramatically as if someone has committed treason by eating it. Even caricatures got in on the act. Satirical prints from the time show greedy merchants hoarding pineapples while peasants stare in confusion. One cartoon titled The Fruit of Folly depicts a man proposing to a pineapple while his bride looks on unimpressed. There's something oddly touching about it all. This wasn't about fruit, not really. It was about aspiration storytelling, a kind of performative belonging. The pineapple was a stage prop in the play of class, and everyone wanted a role. A curator walks past and remarks casually, "We call this wing the Pineapple Vanity Suite." You don't know whether she's joking, and that somehow makes it better. As you move toward the exit, you pass one last portrait. This one is simple. A man sits at a writing desk, pen in hand. There's no pineapple in his lap, no velvet backdrop, no opulent tray, just a small, subtle carving of the fruit in the base of his candlestick. It's understated, almost secretive, a whisper of the trend rather than a scream. And it reminds you beneath all the flamboyant gestures, the rentals, the fake gourds, and portrait poses, some people loved the pineapple quietly, as a dream, a symbol of arrival. A wish frozen in fruit. You step back into the hallway. Your footsteps muffled by thick carpet and old ambition. The paintings watch you leave, and somewhere in the background a pineapple glows, Rain drums softly on the lead glass windows now, and you find yourself seated in a small, creaky library. The fire crackles just enough to add some theatrical ambiance. You're surrounded by books with titles like Treatise on Tropical Imports, A Guide to Polite Consumption, and one especially battered volume, The Melancholy Pineapple Essays on Colonial Longing. Tonight we turn to the deeper current beneath the pineapple's rise, its quiet entanglement with empire and power, and how a tropical fruit came to represent the reach and contradictions of European colonial ambition. By the late 18th century, pineapples weren't just status symbols or architectural punchlines. They were soft power in spiky form, proof that a nation could tame foreign soil, command distant labor, and bend fragile fruit to its banquet tables. Historians still argue whether Britain's obsession with the pineapple reflected actual agricultural interest or merely symbolic conquest. But what's certain is this: where pineapples appeared, colonial fingers were never far behind. You turn a page in your book and find an 1784 speech excerpt delivered by a plantation owner to the Royal Horticultural Society. Let it be known, our fruit now grows on borrowed sun. This is not merely agriculture, it is demonstration. A pineapple on the table meant far more than taste. It meant trade routes secured plantations thriving, however unethically, and navies protecting both. It was the edible badge of imperial logistics. Take, for instance, the Caribbean plantations where pineapples were cultivated alongside sugarcane and bananas. Sometimes as a side crop, sometimes as exotic indulgence. These plantations relied heavily on enslaved labor, something rarely discussed in the polite circles where the fruit was served. And yet in genteel society, these connections were mostly ignored or conveniently veiled in the language of exploration and progress. A dinner guest might toast the tropical miracle on their plate while entirely forgetting or never knowing how many hands had touched the soil, turned it, and harvested the fruit under brutal sun. One anecdote you stumble across is especially absurd. A lady from Derbyshire insisted her table pineapple be served with a small flag indicating its island of origin for authenticity. When asked about the island, she replied, "Oh, I have no idea where that is, but it looks ever so exotic." You try not to sigh. Elsewhere, you find maps, dozens of them, each one covered in careful ink notations plotting out trade routes and spice islands, but with pineapples stamped like trophies across the Atlantic, like a general proudly tracking fruit instead of soldiers. Pineapple imagery also found its way into colonial branding, used in the crests of trading companies carved above plantation gates and printed on crates alongside stamps like Tropic Royal or Sun-Kissed Goods. One tobacco company, oddly enough, even featured a pineapple in its seal with the Latin motto Tempore Fructus, in time the fruit. You step out of the library and into a hallway filled with shipping manifests and ledgers, lists of names, weights, and values. There's a box labeled Fruit Waste from Calabar 1762. Next to it, a page noting the price of pineapples per dozen and the price of human cargo. It's a grim and necessary contrast. And while your journey tonight leans toward the sleepy, there's something quietly sobering about this layer. The pineapple was joy, aspiration, absurdity, but also a signal of whose labor was invisible and whose pride was center stage. Even the famous 18th century pineapple houses, gleaming hothouses filled with candle-heated glass tunnels and perfumed with imported compost, relied on a chain of imperial supply. Rare soil additives, heat-retaining bricks, knowledge borrowed, stolen, or adapted from colonized lands. The science of pineapple growing was itself a stitched-together quilt of global influences, often passed off as purely European ingenuity. And yet, the symbolism outpaced the substance. A guest didn't bite into this knowledge, they simply stared, nodded, and murmured, "Splendid fruit, truly splendid." Back in the study, you find one last quote scratched into the back page of that battered pineapple book. "We built a garden of glass to mimic the sun, but we never once asked who tended the soil." You close the book gently, because while the pineapple may have symbolized welcome and warmth, it also hinted quietly, politely at power. And in some ways it still does. The room shifts again, quieter, now cozier. You're no longer in a grand estate or a shipping warehouse, but in something far more humble, a modest town kitchen somewhere in the English countryside around the early 1800s. The air smells faintly of boiled root vegetables, drying herbs, and just the whisper of something sweet. And sitting in the center of the table is what else, a pineapple. Except this one's been canned. Yes, friend. Welcome to the pineapple's post-peak twilight, its slow, sticky descent from aristocratic stardom into respectable middle-class dessert. You reach for a tarnished spoon and prod the tin, which offers a dull clink. Inside, golden rings floating in syrup like fruit suspended in time. The real pineapple craze may have passed, but the Victorian appetite had not. By the mid-19th century, thanks to improvements in canning preservation and colonial supply lines, pineapples were no longer solely the stuff of kings and courtiers. Now, they appeared in domestic manuals, seaside cafes, and crucially, the middle-class imagination. Historians still argue whether this culinary democratization cheapened the fruit's mystique or finally fulfilled its promise of being for everyone. Either way, the pineapple story took a cozy turn. Less glitter, more gelatin. You flip through a faded 1850s cookbook lying nearby. One recipe reads, pineapple pudding. Best when set 3 hours and served chilled, preferably in a mold shaped like an eel. Another entry, pineapple wine. Simpler than Madeira. Possibly more dangerous. You suppress a chuckle. By this point, pineapples had become culinary Swiss Army knives, stewed, baked, pureed, preserved in rum set in aspic, tucked into trifle, or served alarmingly with roast mutton. You turn to the hearth where a mother gently stirs something bubbling and sugary. She's making pineapple marmalade for her daughter's wedding. It's the bride's favorite, she explains, even if the fruit was tinned. It's still exotic, she says. It's still special. And that's the key, really. Though no longer rare, pineapples retain their emotional cachet, a nostalgic echo of candlelit banquets and velvet gloves, even as they were now being sliced for picnics and school lunches. One popular Victorian confectioner sold pineapple drops with the slogan, "A taste of the tropics for tuppence." Street hawkers cried, "Fruit of the colonies, get your golden rings." Children, meanwhile, reenacted fruit feasts with sugar candies shaped like pineapples, tiny, hard, and liable to chip a molar. You peek into a parlor where a young woman pores over a decorating manual. It features pineapple wallpaper faded gold on green and instructions for arranging centerpieces with fruit feathers and discreet pearls. The goal, it says, is a sense of gracious abundance. Or, as you might say, make your house look like Versailles, with a grocery budget. Even in architecture, the motif stuck around. Pineapple-shaped newel posts, fireplace screens, doorknobs, tea cozies. One enterprising potter crafted an entire tea set that nested together to form a pineapple when not in use. Charming, yes. Practical, absolutely not. You glance around the room and start to notice how pineapple references are hiding in plain sight. Embroidered onto pillowcases, printed on biscuit tins, incorporated into lace patterns, like a secret club that everyone has joined even if no one remembers the handshake. There's something soft and endearing about this phase of pineappledom. No longer a status weapon, the fruit had become a shared dream. The comforting fantasy of tropical warmth on a foggy British morning. You picture a girl scraping the last bit of pineapple jelly from her plate and asking, "Did queens eat this too?" Yes, they did. But so did chimney sweeps, and governesses, and tax collectors with a soft spot for tarts. The pineapple had lost its mystery, maybe, but it had gained something sturdier affection. Even its former absurdities were now remembered fondly. The fake fruit, the portrait poses, the velvet cushions. They became punchlines. Then family stories, then nostalgic decorations at village fetes. One town even held an annual Pineapple Day, complete with a parade, a themed bake-off, and a surprisingly competitive game of pass the rind. And so you settle by the window watching mist gather on the glass, the tin of canned pineapple still open beside you. It's quiet now. The kind of quiet where you notice the clock ticking, the wood creaking your own breath. The pineapple rests on a porcelain dish, not gilded, not rented, just there. Still golden, still sweet, just simpler now. Night has settled in fully now. Outside, gas lamps flicker like polite stars, and the wind moves through the alleyways with a tired sort of grace. You're back where you started or somewhere like it. A candle burns low, and beside it on a shelf worn smooth by time sits one last pineapple. Not a real one. This is papier-mâché painted with care, a bit scuffed from years of admiration. You reach out to touch it. The surface is cool, rough in spots, slightly tacky where the lacquer has worn thin. It doesn't smell like anything, but it feels like history. And here at last we land on the strange truth at the heart of this story. Most people who loved the pineapple never tasted one. This fruit, tropical, temperamental, and too expensive to eat, was admired, imitated, copied, and coveted, all for what it represented. It was an edible illusion, a gilded mirage. A celebrity fruit famous not for its flavor but for its reputation. Historians still argue whether this obsession was uniquely British or just particularly well documented. France, too, dabbled in pineapple theatrics. Louis XV once threw a ball themed entirely around pineapples, complete with pineapple-scented fountains. Spain had colonies that grew them with far less fuss. The Dutch painted them in still lifes. But nowhere else, perhaps, did the fruit enjoy such social acrobatics, from worshipped icon to paperweight to trifle topping. You find an old catalog of 19th-century novelty goods. There, among the spectacles and foot warmers, is an entire page dedicated to pineapple-adjacent items, pineapple-shaped sugar molds. A fruit-form hat pin, a nightlight encased in pineapple glass. Even a small cushion embroidered with the phrase, "Ever welcome." That phrase again. Because if the pineapple began as an exotic stranger, it ended as a symbol of hospitality, a smiling fruit at the threshold, announcing to friend and passerby alike, "Come in, stay, feel special," even if what made it special had changed. By the time we reach the turn of the 20th century, pineapples were commonplace, cheapened perhaps, but loved in a new way. They'd been democratically dethroned, no longer unreachable jewels, just cheerful additions to a breakfast table. Pineapple upside-down cake, anyone. And you know what? There's something beautiful about that, about watching something so absurdly inaccessible become familiar, beloved. Not because of price or rarity, but because it simply made people happy. The pineapple had survived the long voyage from imperial object to kitchen staple, and in doing so, it had left behind a trail of strange, sleepy wonder velvet-lined fruit trays, portraits with unripe props, door knockers, and stone-canned rings on white bread. You smile now gently at how silly it all was and how strangely touching. Because we humans, bless us, will always find something to obsess over, to elevate, to laugh about later, and secretly still adore. And the pineapple, oh, it wore that role well. So you rise from your chair, stretch, and cast one last glance around the dimly lit room. There's that fruit fake flaking proud, and somehow, despite everything, still a little magical. So now you settle deeper into the quiet. Your breathing slows. The last traces of candlelight flicker on the ceiling like faraway sails on a sea of calm. The story has drifted gently to its end, much like a pineapple-laden ship easing into harbor, its precious cargo swaying ever so slightly in the dark. You've wandered through lavish feasts, smoky kitchens, windswept docks, and silk-draped parlors, trailing behind this one very odd, very golden fruit. It's been a journey of puffed wigs, velvet cushions, and gentle absurdity. But above all, it's been slow, soft, wonderfully pointless in the most comforting way. Now the pineapple rests again, not as a punchline, not as a symbol, but just as a shape you can close your eyes around. Spiky, golden, steady, You've followed it long enough. It's okay to let it go. Let the quiet grow a little heavier. Let your breath melt into the softness of your bed or your couch or whatever nook you've made for yourself tonight. Let your thoughts wander, but not too far. Maybe to a candlelit greenhouse. Maybe to a pineapple-shaped teapot. Maybe to nothing at all. No more wigs, no more imports, no more puzzled goats being offered strange fruit. Just the stillness now. The kind that fills up slowly like a room where no one speaks, but everyone understands. We're done here. You did well to come this far. You can rest now. Good night.